Hello, friends. This is John Burness. I am a composer, poet, and performing poet and a poetry educator. And of course, one of my biggest quests right now is to further the development of the medium of sound poetry and to really get its foot in the ground in the Western canon. In other words, to just make it a more officially and academically recognized form of art, as I feel it is nowhere near as respected as it could be. So I already have an entire series about sound poetry titled Why Sound Poetry that you can find on my YouTube and my Substack. So this is actually going to be a bonus or some special episode in this series that I wasn't really going to do, but the idea came to me a couple days ago, and I thought this was a com- very compelling topic to talk about in the medium of sound poetry. So I'm going to talk into why sound poetry is not music. What is the difference between sound poetry and music? As I feel that this might be, if all goes well and this becomes a more respected form of art, that might be a very common question that people will ask. So I feel I should tackle it here. So I feel the best way to compare the two, rather than starting by just going over broad definitions and other stuff that you can easily look up, I'm going to compare it to what I feel very strongly to be the most similar musical equivalent of sound poetry, which is actually more of a practice than a music genre. It's called singing of the spirit. It is a practice that is done by Pentecostal and charismatic Christian movements and churches, which is basically, for those that don't know what it is when you are basically at a church and worship music is playing almost always in a Pentecostal church or predominantly in a Pentecostal church. And then it compels people that they are filled with the Spirit. And then they start singing in non-lexical, very fancy word glossolalia, which is Latin. It means like a language that doesn't exist, but you're compelling it to exist. So there are words and syllables and phrases that don't exist in principle and in theory, and we're singing it out of us because they feel that that is Christ in their body, making them speak a heavenly language rather than an earthly language. And there's actually a lot of biblical verses to back that up, but this is not what this is about. This is about sound poetry. So this appears to be the best video example of what singing of the spirits is. So we're going to watch this video together, and then I'm going to break down because this is definitely the closest equivalent or the closest bridge between music and sound poetry. So I'm going to watch this with all of you guys, and then I'm going to break down some key points as to why this is not classified as sound poetry, even though at face value they're pretty much identical, which is using human speech to use phrases that don't really exist in linguistic format, but using it to tell a convincing story. So let's go watch this, shall we?
Come on, give it all to him. All to Jesus. Did you hear me? I said, give it all to Jesus. We love you, Jesus. Come on, you used your English. What happened to your heavenly? Do you hear that? Come on, stir up your innermost being. You don't need another worship song. We don't worship the song. We worship the Lord. So lift up your voice.
So well. All right.
Lift your voice, lift your voice. The enemy has no clue what you're singing, but the Holy Spirit is alive. So lift up your voice. Come on, don't let the enemy take your worship now. Let it come out of your innermost being.
Lift up your voice. Come on, don't let the enemy take your worship now. Let it come out of your innermost being.
Keep lifting up your voice. Do you see this? You see this? She's 19. She's 19. That's my daughter, and she's in love with Jesus. Are you in love with Jesus? Then lift your voice and let Jesus sing to you, and you sing to him.
You see this? You see this? She's 19. She's 19.
We worship you, Lord. Let our voices reverberate this place. Let it go from here to the nations, Lord. Here's the interpretation. I worship you with every fiber of my being. Bless the Lord, oh my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Come on. Bless the Lord. voice like the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He's not coming back like a gentle little lamb. He's coming back with fire in his eyes and a sword in his hand. Lift up your voice. We glorify your name, oh God.
What's happened to the cry of the church that has a voice like the Lion of the tribe of Judah? He's not coming back like a gentle little lamb. He's coming back with fire in his eyes. God, lift up your voice. Oh, we glorify you.
Okay. Okay, so that is the closest musical equivalent to sound poetry, singing of the spirits, which, if you take it at face value, is almost identical to sound poetry, which is using the human voice or other, using the human voice more or less, not in syntactic or normal linguistic ways, but in ways that still tell a poetic story. Um, and I found some of this very beautiful, mostly from the audience perspective. Watching the audience was really beautiful. Not so much the gentleman who I assume is Roy Fields, interpreting his own singing of the spirits, bringing his daughter into this massive stadium, showing her off and stuff. But watching the audience really, without any judgment against their own capabilities, produce these sounds that don't make any sense, and they're willing to do it without judging themselves. It's a very beautiful thing to watch, even though I'm definitely not a terribly religious person, not a terribly Christian person. But I see a lot of beauty in that, mainly from the audience. Now, for the difference between sound poetry and music, there's really two key points as to the main differences between the two. First of all, I don't think I need to share this anymore. So, okay. First of all, um, unfortunately, this was not a very good example of the part of music that makes music unique. But music is sound based and poetry is story based. And when we get to advanced mediums, the differences between the two become much more apparent, much more obvious. Um, so, probably the most famous sound poetry practitioner in the world, Jacques Blanc. I showed him my. I actually introduced him to my concept, my type of sound poetry I invented called echosemantic. Which, if you want to know more about that, it's on my Substack. And unfortunately, he called it simultaneous poetry with modern recording capabilities. That's how he described my poetry. But yet, that's really the difference between music and poetry. Now, let's go to the advanced mediums. Music is sound. And of course, to capture sound in medium, you use recording technology, whether that's digital or analog, doesn't matter. But anyway, it's digital. Whereas poetry is always about story and narrative. And if you tweak it for the sound's sake, it becomes music or maybe sound art. But if you keep doing more mediums, but making the story the center of it, that's sound poetry. And the easiest way I can describe this is a little bit of a story I have. So I'm actually acquaintances with the pretty notable modern poet named Brian Lewis Saunders, which I highly recommend you check out his works. He is an enormously talented poet. Um, So I actually made another form of, I actually invented another form of poetry called disintegration poetry, which is poetry that becomes more spacious and more glitchy and more minimal and becomes less and less of itself the further the poem goes down. And I talked to Brian about this, and he actually said, "No, this is not poetry. This is sound art." And I said, "No, this is poetry. This is not sound art." And I'll tell you why I won that case. So I did not do any audio editing when I performed my disintegration poetry because I released audio excerpts of it. So I did not edit them at all. I did not chop anything up, which he thought that's what disintegration poetry meant. I didn't chop anything up on a DAW or FL Studio or something like that. I didn't maximize using effects like reverb. I was just using poetry out of my body, out of my mouth, and manipulating it using uh, advanced language techniques, for lack of a better word. If I kept manipulating it using sound techniques, audio techniques, it would count as music and sound art. But since the poem is the center of it, and that other than the recording of it, there's really nothing else that says that it's an audio project, then it's poetry. And the simplest way I can say this is that sound poetry has to be performable, in my personal opinion. To keep poetry relevant and to keep making more advanced forms of poetry, it still has to be performable. Because pretty much for all of human history, or the entire history of poetry, it's always been a performable form of art. It's actually widely agreed that stories and poems oracally told people through their families is actually older than the alphabet. So it's always been about performance and reciting something and remembering something that is story related. Whether that story makes linguistic sense is not relevant. And when it doesn't make sense, it's sound poetry. Um, so so yeah, it has to be performable. Um, you have to be whatever you perform as your own sound poetry, which I hope you do. I would love to make that difference in people's lives. It has to be something that you can perform live. It can't be something that you can only bound in a home studio because then that's music. Because that means it all depends on sound. And if it's sound dependent, then it's music. Um, so no matter if it's sound poetry or other forms of poetry, to me, to keep poetry alive, you have to keep it performable. It has to be something you can remember, something you can recite, and something you can perform before an audience without any audio techniques, audio recording techniques. So that's point number one. And point number two is more or less the history behind the two forms of art, music and poetry, the history behind the two. So this one's a little more harder to put into words. So you have to think of it kind of like Carl Jung's method of you can't taste happiness without knowing what depression is like. You won't ever know how brightly a light shines if you haven't seen darkness yet. And that's sort of it's sort of the exact same way between sort of nonsensical sound poetry and very narrative driven usual poetry. The usual poetry meaning haikus, meaning elegies, um, meaning quatrains, um, all the normal stuff that is language based. And to ensure that poetry was the medium before sound poetry. It's so hard to explain this. Um, you kind of you because you can't. I like that whole Carl Jung idea about how how a tree. Marco Pierre White said this. A tree without roots is just a piece of wood. So to keep sound poetry, and to prevent it from going into music territory, is it does sort of, in my experience, has to be very mimicky. It has to sort of mimic normal poetry. And you have to explain to people that it does mimic sound poetry, that it mimics normal poetry. Um, so, whereas singing of the spirit and other similarities to sound poetry, like Bobby McFerrin, is very similar to sound poetry. It's still oriented in sound, in music techniques. You have to understand, in Bobby McFerrin's example, you have to understand that his sounds were usually achievable by very different instruments, where he does it with his own voice. And if you can point out and prove that, um, if you can point out and prove that he's mimicking music, or that he's the very least deriving from music, then that makes it music. And the same thing with Singing of the Spirit that we just watched. It's basically non lexical, non syntactic singing. And if you have the brains or the memory to realize that that singing of the spirit is derived from normal singing, and you can't recognize singing of the spirit without knowing what usual singing is, singing of lyrics, singing of poems, singing of stories, then you know that singing of the spirit is music oriented. But now with poetry, um, if you could take, either by the performer doing it, by the poet performing the poem, or by the actual poem provided, if you can actually prove and see and notice that to have this non-lexical, this almost nonsensical sound poetry, this huge aggregate of sounds that don't make any sense, and you can prove that it's derived from poetry that does make sense, poetry that is traditional, poetry that is language based, poetry that the two also have together is that they're both performable, which proves the first point. Um, so yeah, so you can't have light without knowing what the darkness is. Just as you can't have the knowledge of what normal poetry resembles versus what sound poetry must be. So it's all about that. So an important key thing to try to decipher what the difference is all noticing the duality between the two, the duality between what extreme comes from the other extreme. And I can come up with so many examples, like they can be very simple to very complicated, like Harry Parch's 48 tone scale. But if you have the knowledge that he's deriving that from a 12 tone equal temperament, then we know that those two are music oriented. Or um, if we take the, what's the name of that book? The saga, the collected works of Billy the Kid. If we take that experimental fictional, um, those fictional poetry, and tie that to that we know Billy the Kid was an actual person with a life story, and that the person who wrote the book was a poet, we can connect that it's poetry related. So to summarize, the 2 points is to keep poetry relevant, we have to keep poetry performable. That's one of my things that I'm preaching to everyone in the poetry community. And the second is you have to notice the extreme of whatever extreme form of art you're looking at. If you can notice what the other extreme of that art is, then you can easily conclude what what medium it actually is. And I felt I had to explain that because with sound poetry and music, singing of the spirit, Bobby McFerrin, sound poetry, it does get a little gray and hard to understand. I know even I had a hard time articulating some of this, but I hope you at the very least learned something, and I hope I can clear confusion for anyone in the future. And thank you very much for watching.